Hello and welcome to the Science Fiction and Fantasy Marketing Podcast, the show where we help you establish your author brand, increase the size of your audience, and sell more books. I'm Lindsay Baroker, and I'm here with Jeffrey Poole and Joe Lalo. We have another great guest for you this week, Data Guy. That's his real name. It's on his birth certificate. And he is you have probably heard of him, he's kind of the incognito author who runs the Author Earnings Report site, along with Hugh Howey. And I don't know how much he was doing these days, but we knew Data Guy was the mastermind behind everything, so we invited him to chat with us tonight.
Not even close. He's the real brains of the operation. Hi, Lindsay, and hi, guys. Exciting to join.
All right, thanks for coming on. So for those who have been in a, coffin or box or writing cave perhaps for the last few years or 2 years, could you tell us what exactly the Author's Earnings Report is and how you got started?
Sure. Well, the Author Earnings Report it's a quarterly analysis where we break down the U.S. ebook market. Most of the time we focus on Amazon, but we've also branched out to look at the other retailers, the big ones anyway, Barnes & Noble, Apple, Kobo, Google. And we track sort of quarter by quarter how U.S. ebook sales, and even more importantly, since we're all authors for the most part, dollar author earnings are getting divided up between the different sectors of publishing. So we look at indie authors as a segment. We look at small and medium publishers. We lump them together. We look at Amazon's own imprints. This is Montlake, Thomas and Mercer, Little A, etc., Amazon Crossing. And then we also look at, as a sector, the big five, and this is the big New York publishers, Penguin Random House, Macmillan, Simon & Schuster, Hachette, and who am I forgetting? HarperCollins. So along the way, we've in addition to breaking down the market in pie charts, we also kind of look at whatever comes to mind that's interesting to us at the time. We've looked at pricing and the effect pricing has on sales. We've looked at DRM, genre breakdowns, books without ISBNs, International Standard Book numbers, and we've looked at, say, how authors who have longer tenure and who've been around publishing for a decade or more are doing relative to newer debut authors. So it's really sort of whatever is on our mind at the time that we think is relevant. In the latest report, we look at online print and audio sales too. Pretty much, you and I will sort of get an idea, we'll spitball back and forth what we might want to look at in the next report, and then we pull the data and dig in.
Awesome, and we're going to ask you about how everybody's stacking up and what genres are doing well and that kind of thing, but I'm curious how you're getting your information exactly.
Sure, well, what we're doing is really not rocket science. The only thing interesting about what we're doing is the scale at which we're doing it. So, well, first of all, Author Earnings was one of those really sort of serendipitous things that came together almost accidentally, where the kind of thing where if you did it, in a fiction book, everyone would kind of go, yeah, right, that's straining my credulity a bit. Hugh and I were kind of coming at this separately from two very different places. He had already had this incredible success as an indie, so he was going around the country and talking to media and talking to authors, and all the media wanted to focus on was sort of the high flyers, the multimillionaire, outliers. And in the meantime, he's talking to all these authors, names you've never heard of, who are paying bills, who are quitting their day jobs, and really sort of building indie careers, and it's below the radar. None of the media wants to talk about that. All they want to talk about is either, sort of the big multi-million success stories or how indie authors only make $50 a year. And so he's trying to get the media focused on this without any success, and at the same time, and this is sort of 2 years ago, back in January of 2014 or so, I had just released my second novel. My first one had done okay, but when the second came out, they both sort of seemed to take off together. So here I was looking at how well I was doing and going, but the thing is, I'm not an outlier because half the people around me in the bestseller rankings are also indies and the ones up above me. So there's really something going on, that isn't captured by what we're seeing in the media coverage. And if you think back 2 years, this was the era of a lot of negative, sort of misinformed media coverage about self-publishing, how all self-published books were like these 99-cent, Microsoft Paint cover things, no editing, rejected by traditional publishers, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm scratching my head and I'm going, you know what? I never even once considered submitting to agents or publishers or whatever all that pre-internet old school stuff was. I mean, why would anyone do that nowadays? So I'm looking at all this. I'm reading and listening to these industry spokespeople that are supposed to know something about publishing, and the market stats they're quoting bear absolutely zero resemblance to what I'm seeing, what any of us can see in the bestseller rankings on Amazon and Barnes & Noble every day. It was surreal. It's like listening to a bunch of people talking about how the ocean's red, and you're looking at it and it's as blue as can be. And so I'm trying to figure this out. Am I missing something here, or are they? And it was right around that time that a really big publishing imprint approaches me. They email me and they want to republish one of my indie novels. I guess they could see it was doing well in the rankings, getting reviews, and it was kind of a dilemma. I mean, I was flattered, but I couldn't get them to commit to particular marketing spends in writing. I come out of the video game publishing industry, and there it's very typical. When a publisher approaches a developer, they're like, all right, we want to publish your game. You're like, all right, tell me about the marketing you're going to do. Break it down for us. How much are you willing to commit to in the contract? And what are those campaigns going to be? And the publisher actually commits to all this. So it was really weird to me that I couldn't get the publisher to put into the contract exactly how many dollars they were going to spend, where they were going to spend it, when they were going to spend it. And I'm looking at the advance, and it was the classic story that you hear, as almost as a joke so many times. I'm looking at their advance and going, I made that last month. So I don't get it. This doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. And so, at the same time, that self-doubt kicks in. You're like, is this a fluke? Is this, just something that's not going to last? If I say no and I stay indie, am I going to regret this? But if I sign my book over and I've only got 2 books, am I going to be kicking myself in 6 months? So I'm really sort of agonizing over this, and I'm talking to other authors that I know, and you're getting 2 completely different views of the world of publishing. The traditional guys are like, oh no, grab it, go, go, go. And the ones who have had success with indie publishing are like, well, you really should evaluate this. We think the world is changing. And so I'm kind of a techie and a data guy, and I needed some hard data to make my decision, and there just wasn't any out there. The stats that were out there were describing a world that wasn't the world that I was seeing. So you guys have seen the movie Taken, or at least heard the tagline, right? About I have a very special set of skills. Well, it just so happened I had done a lot of competitive analysis on App Store rankings for major video game publishers. Video games is a lot more tech-savvy in industry, so it was very routine to monitor the Apple, App Store bestseller rankings, and because the publishers that I was working for and working with had different games that were selling at different points along the bestseller rankings, it was easy to look at how our competitors were doing as well, because if we had a game above theirs and a game below theirs, we knew pretty much what theirs was selling as well. And so I looked at the Amazon bestseller rankings and started doing some stuff with pencil and paper and Excel, and I said, you know what, forget it. And applied the skills that I had, wrote a web crawling spider, and basically scraped the top 7,000 or 8,000 best-selling books in their rankings, and then broke them down. I was looking for sales ranking data, and a lot of indies had already kind of done this. They had shared data on, if you're at rank 100, you're selling about 1,000 books a day. If you're at rank 1,500, you're selling about 100 books a day. The data was out there. I think Teresa Reagan and David Gaughran, to come to mind. I think Edward W. Robinson had also shared some of this data, so it was very easy to plug that into it and figure out how many books per day they were selling, and then apply the Amazon 70%, and then do the same for traditional publishers and apply the 25% of net, which was about 17.5%. And so I did that, and what I saw just blew me away. It was so far beyond even my wildest expectations. I knew indies were doing well, but I hadn't even dreamed it was possible that as a sector, you know, they were going toe-to-toe with the biggest publishers in the world on Amazon and holding their own, and in many cases doing better. And so I had talked to Hugh before. Hugh is, I mean, you know Hugh, he's super nice. He talks to everybody, and so when he and I were sort of trading places for #1 in science fiction for a week or so, I was emailing him, and he was, you know, very encouraging and, you know, very nice about it. And so we had chatted about self-publishing change we were seeing in the industry. So, and he had expressed the frustration at not being able to get anybody to focus on this. So as soon as I pulled this data, I just said, you know, Hugh, let me email you this. Take a look. There's the untold story of self-publishing right there in black and white. So what should we do about it? And it was just, you know, he almost fell out of his chair too. It was, you know, really this amazing moment where we both knew we had something that was going to turn the industry upside down. And, you know, we debated going to various media outlets with it, and they really weren't that excited about it. I mean, the tale of, you know, a new publishing mid-list, a middle class, isn't as exciting as the tale of Outliers. And so we said, you know what, let's just put this out there ourselves. You know, we'll put it out there anonymized for authors and see where it goes. And the rest is kind of history. So I guess in a nutshell, that's what Author Earnings is and how it got started. Lindsay, are you on mute?
We can't hear you, Lindsay. Okay. Well, until Lindsay gets her microphone figured out, here, I'll ask her the next question for her. She has asked, what's the reception then, both from indies as well as traditional publishers and others in the industry?
To say that it was polarizing would probably be an understatement. You know, the first report went out there, and, you know, of course, a lot of indies saw it as validation of their hard work and their career choices. And at the same time, it totally flew in the face of what the conventional wisdom on publishing was, which is that, you know, you want to go out there and submit to an agent, I guess, or to a publisher, and then, you know, if you can't do that, maybe self-publishing is a fallback. And what we were saying, we were very upfront about it. We said, you know what, we've looked at the data and we think this may be turning around to where self-publishing for most writers is a preferred first choice way. And so naturally, a lot of the traditional publishing industry saw that as, you know, critical, or they viewed it in a very negative light initially.
I'll bet.
What's funny is how much things have moderated, like in the 2 years since. You know, we've our track record hasn't hurt, and it's really kind of a cheat. I almost feel bad because we can see what's going on right now when we take, you know, our cross-sectional snapshots of ebook sales, and the traditional statistics come rolling in 3 or 4 months later. And so we're out there saying, hey, you know, we see this trend. You know, Penguin Random House's return to agency meant the big 5's share of ebooks have dropped about 10%. And then 4 months later, hey, the big 5's share of ebooks have dropped about 10%. So what we've basically seen, although the publishers themselves have been pretty silent about it, at least in public, privately, I've had lots of great dialogue with some of the top analysts on the traditional side, the guys who cover the market there. And so we've got this back channel dialogue going where we compare notes and numbers. And some of these guys are really sharp. They've helped me calibrate author earnings against other industry statistics. And it's a mutually beneficial thing because author earnings also gives them visibility into something that the traditional industry metrics don't cover. It basically fills in a hole for them. So, I mean, I guess what it comes down to is behind the scenes we're all data geeks trying to get a clearer picture of this industry. It's a crazy industry.
Sounds like it. How are you able to extrapolate income from these snapshots of the Amazon store?
So again, when we do a report on Amazon, we're only talking about income on Amazon, and even more specifically, income from books ranked high enough to actually show up on one of Amazon's bestseller lists. Now, if you're way down in the weeds, nonfiction, education, psychology, neuropathies, for example, you may be selling one book a day and be in the top 100 for that really, really granular subcategory. So that doesn't necessarily mean we're only looking at the best, the really high-selling books. We're getting a pretty broad cross-section, and with our latest, sort of scaled-up industrial strength spider, we're pulling 200,000 ebooks at a shot. We're basically looking at the sales of 200,000 of Amazon's top ebooks, which is about 60% of their sales that day. We're actually capturing and able to break down. And then when we compare that to, or rather align those rankings with what we know the sales are roughly at each ranking, the pie charts become very, very easy to sort out. We made a change, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds if it's something that'll bore our audience right now, but we recently made a change for 2016 where we said instead of having these somewhat anecdotal curves for rank to sales, we're going to base it on hard data. So I reached out to several authors, high-selling and low-selling authors, and several others contacted me, and we basically set it up to where their actual raw Amazon reported sales and their actual raw Amazon rankings are being fed into our algorithm. And based on that, we're able to build the curve. If you look at our February report, you'll actually see their data. There's a graph plotted on a logarithmic scale where you can see sales and corresponding rankings. Every one of those little circles is a given book on a given day. So it's a process that has become a great deal more exact over the last 2 years.
Fantastic.
All right, I got the next question. You had said earlier that you were using like a web scraper. You could talk about a web crawler, and do you have any special access at this point, or is this still all just stuff that's available to anyone who's got the internet or scripting skills?
It's available to anyone who has the internet or the scripting skills required. The only thing that we're doing that maybe is beyond the reach of most people is the scale at which we're doing it. I mean, I don't want to geek out right now and start talking about terabytes and gigabits of network bandwidth required, but in the day and age of cloud computing, you can literally spin up, and we do for these reports, 250 really high-powered multi-core servers and launch them with the same scraper tech on them at the same time. So within an hour, we're basically scraping over 1 million Amazon product pages and then shutting it down before the cloud computing costs burn a hole in our bank account, because it's several $100s an hour when it's up and running.
That's sort of at the scale where it's almost a denial of service attack, really.
It is. It's something where with a minor change, the spider could be a very devastating DDoS. But this is Amazon we're talking about, so it's just a drop in the bucket. I've often wondered, if anybody over there notices, scales peg over into the red when we run this thing, but I doubt it.
Yeah, it's also you had said how like now you have actual calibration points. That was a question I hadn't put on my list, but I was sort of interested in like if it was all extrapolated based upon anecdotal stuff, or if you actually had points of calibration. So I'm glad to know about that too.
Yeah, no, we've gotten really scientific with the calibration for a few reasons. One is, of course, to improve the accuracy, but the other is somewhat nearer and dearer to our hearts because, frankly, being off by 5% or 4% doesn't really change the pie charts. What we're after now is measuring the absolute numbers. I want to know how many books Amazon is selling per day, and I want to know if that's changing over time. Is it going up? Is it going down? And until we've got something that we can pin from a rank to sales relationship standpoint to a particular point in time, say January, and then come back and redo that calculation again in April, all we can talk about is relative market share. We can't talk about whether the size of the pie is growing or shrinking. So that was the main impetus behind this change and taking things to another level with the raw data.
I've got a question for you. I've been curious to know is you just mentioned that obviously it costs you guys hundreds of dollars an hour when you're running these things. How long does it take to generate all your reports and assemble them into a recognizable, usable format?
That's a great question. The fact of the matter, the actual spider itself runs at this point in just about an hour. Prior to that hour run, there's a lot of software tweaks I have to make every single time. Everyone who's familiar with web scraping will at this point be kind of nodding and going, ouch, because it's fragile. It's a fragile technology base. Amazon is constantly tweaking their their product pages and their bestseller lists, making small changes to the web HTML. And all those changes tend to break our spider because it's used to looking for things in certain places on those pages.
Makes you wonder if they do that on purpose.
There's a whole tangent conversation we can have there. The answer is they do it on purpose, but not to deny anybody anything. They do it to test what are the most effective merchandising things, and at any given point they'll have dozens of A/B tests running where they've moved something from one part of the page to another just to see what gets the most clicks. And it's funny because when you're writing the spider, you're very sensitive to these things. You actually see what they're trying out, like 1 out of every 10 pages comes back with a different size button, for example. But it's usually too subtle for most people to notice when they're just clicking the web page. The web scraping is an inherently fragile technology, and so usually I'll spend an hour or two prior to each report, catching and fixing all those changes. And then we hit the button, kaboom, burn a hole in the bank account for about an hour or so, then shut it down, pull the data, and then start crunching the data and doing the analysis. So the data crunching itself, is just Hugh and I spitballing stuff back and forth where we say, hey, what about this? Have we looked at this? It would be really interesting to look at that. We saw a news story about, A, B, or C. Let's see what the data says about that. And then when we're done, we'll basically write it up. And depending on his schedule and my schedule, because this is just kind of a hobby thing we do on the side, it might be a few days to a week where we're each making several passes and adding things, co-editing it. And then we just toss it out there and move on to the next one.
Alrighty. Well, if Lindsay was here, I'm sure she'd be asking the question. So what do the reports say? How much are indie authors making in comparison to traditionally published authors and small presses?
So as a group, indies are absolutely killing it in ebooks. And again, one of the counter arguments I often hear about these reports is, hey, you're basically making a very unfair comparison because you're only measuring indies where they're strongest. I'm like, well, yeah. If I had access to print data from bookstores, I would include that as well, and I'm doing everything I can to include it. But at the end of the day, I'm working with what I've got, and we've got industry statistics to kind of balance out the other side of things and look at the two together. But what's even more remarkable is how that has changed over the past 2 years. 2 years ago, I was blown away because indies, I could see, had about 30% of the ebook market in unit terms. Almost 1 out of every 3 ebooks purchased on Amazon was an indie ebook. and roughly a third of all dollars authors were earning on Amazon were going to indie authors. Now, that doesn't mean a third of all dollars consumers were spending on Amazon ebooks were on indie ebooks, because you also have to consider that an indie is getting something between 35 cents and usually closer to 70 cents on the dollar for every book, whereas a traditional publisher is getting, 17 cents on the dollar. A traditionally published author is getting roughly 17.5 cents on the dollar, while his or her publisher keeps the lion's share. So when you compare just what are the authors making, that's where, the indie share is disproportionately huge. Even so, a third was amazing. That was 2 years ago. Since then, the market's flipped upside down. Traditional publishers went from 60% of the market back then to, at this point, gosh, what is it? The big five make up less than a quarter of ebook unit sales and less than a quarter of author earnings. Traditional publishing as a whole is less than half. It's like 45% of ebook sales on Amazon. So, as blown away as I was 2 years ago, right now it's like, okay, this is getting eerie. I'm waiting for the first report to come back where the trend reverses. I'm almost hoping it happens.
Well, if the traditional publishers keep charging, like, what is it, like $15.99 for a Kindle, and you see right there that like the same price for the actual hardcover, you're like, man, they're just, I mean, I realize that they can set the price whatever they want, but when you have so many more books that are priced way cheaper, and most of them are written just as well, I mean, yeah, you can't really lose there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a deliberate choice they're making. I mean, as a group of publishers, they're looking at it and saying, there's one arena where we have difficulty competing because we have a cost structure that our competitors, basically small publishers, indie authors, and Amazon imprints, just don't have to carry. And we cannot compete effectively in that arena, and we don't want consumers shifting more and more into that arena where we can't compete as effectively. So if we can raise the price to where people are more inclined to buy paper and more inclined to buy hardcovers, we can keep the bookstore side of things a larger piece of the industry. We can shrink ebook sales, our own ebook sales, and hopefully get close to making up for that in print sales and essentially preserve our competitive advantage. So it's not entirely a poor strategy. How it's playing out in real life, remains to be seen. That chapter hasn't been written yet. But one of the flip sides of it is a whole lot of incorrect New York Times headlines about ebook sales are shrinking. Well, guess what? They aren't. Amazon is out there saying they aren't, and our data confirms it. The only thing that's shrinking is the share of those ebook sales that goes to the big five and to the largest traditional publishers. So it's a really funny dichotomy.
Cool beans. Joe?
Yep. Well, also I think it's kind of funny, like it's a situation where the gatekeepers were preventing a lot of people from getting in, and then eventually somebody figured out, hey, over here there aren't even any walls, let alone gatekeepers. Let's just all go in this side.
It's like if you have two ships at sea, this is going to be one of those terrible on-the-fly analogies that goes south and we're all embarrassed and we walk away from it. But people are jumping out of one boat into the other, and the captain of one boat is announcing to everyone that, hey, folks are disappearing, everyone's drowned.
Exactly.
Well, not really. See that other boat? That's where they all are.
Yep. All right. A thing we talk about a lot on this show is keeping momentum. This a thing that indies can do that often big publishers can't, with the rule of thumb being like releasing a book, say, once every 2 or 3 months to keep your sales up and keep from falling off the new release cliff and stuff like that. Do you keep or calculate any stats on launch frequency?
So we hadn't, but that's such an excellent question that about 30 minutes before hopping on with you guys, I went and took a look at it. And so I wouldn't read too much into what I found, but I ran a quick query and I looked at, okay, looking at just January 10 and just the books that are on the bestseller list from January 10, how many belong to different authors and what are the spacings, the average spacings between their release dates. And then I broke that down by month, and I looked at how much authors were making per book as a function of how many months apart those books were released. And so I didn't find a great deal of correlation. There did appear to be a small peak right around 5 months, which was interesting. But it wasn't a really dramatic thing. I think it was maybe 40% more, and there was enough, noise on the other months that it could have been a fluke. But then I also pulled out just the indies and looked at it for just indies, and there was that same peak at around 4 to 5 months. But I mean, like I said, I wouldn't read too much into it, because between 1 month apart and 11 months apart, there was less than 40% variation in the averages. But then you get to 12, 13 months, and it goes off a cliff.
Oh, that's good to know.
Bottom line is, don't do what I have done, and make sure that you're releasing at least once a year. I'm coming up on 2 years without a release, and that's, I just need to write faster.
That's everyone's problem.
I don't know. I mean, you guys are prolific. I mean, I'm impressed. My hat's off to authors who can maintain that pace.
Well, hopefully we can continue to do it. One more question. Have you seen any notable correlations between basic stats and overall income, like total number of books, number of series, number of reviews? Any of that seem to have a strong correlation to earnings?
You know what's interesting? We haven't looked at that, and when I did try to do a real quick query, because of the way we collect just what's on the bestseller lists, the more books that are on there, you get a reverse correlation. But it's a total false signal. Like if I've got 10 books that happen to be on the bestseller lists, odds are good. Some of them are older. Odds are good. Some of them are down there, and that drags down my average relative to someone who's riding high with just one. So I would say we release the raw data anonymized, but it's all there with every single report, and we're always excited when people download that and do their own analyses. So this seems like a great thing. I would love it if someone would do that, and I think we would all love to hear what they find.
Alrighty, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Have you found anything that has completely surprised you in the stats? Like, for example, authors who released, and I asked this for a reason, obviously. For example, authors who have released titles in multiple genres do better than those who only write in one, or so forth.
Unfortunately, we haven't looked at that particular question, and it's one that's of interest to me too, because I'm a little bit all over the map, even on a per title basis. I have people tell me my books are, thrillers, horror, mystery, sci-fi. And I'm like, and they're all absolutely convinced that that's what genre it is. And I'm going, you know what? The last person in the world to know what genre they're writing in is usually the author. So, you and I both have a deep interest in this, and it's surprising I haven't looked at that. That would be another great candidate for someone to download. We do have all of the categories the book is listed in as one of the columns in the spreadsheet, so it could easily be parsed out and broken down. With that said, the first thing that Hugh and I found with our first report that just completely floored us, I mean, it was the complete opposite of what the conventional industry wisdom was at the time. We found that the indie books had on average significantly better Amazon review scores than books by the biggest traditional publishers. I'm like, whoa. And remember, this is the tsunami of crap days, right? This is when, every week there was another great article out there about what trash indie books were. And we were looking at hard data that showed, at least from a consumer perspective, indie books were preferred. And so Hugh and I went back and forth on this a lot. We're like, could this be some other factor factoring in? Hugh thought it might be price. He said, look, when a book is less expensive, people see you know, they have a feeling like they got more value for it, and they're going to rate it more highly. And of course, I disagreed with them. I said, you know what? I think to compete without a publisher's marketing and to ride high in the rankings, an indie book just plain has to be better. You know, because it has to spread by word of mouth. So.
Yeah. And there's a lot of us authors that actually will, put like it's usually a small blurb, myself included, in the back matter that says, "Hey, I'm an indie author. I appreciate you taking the time to buy and read the book. If you like it, I would love it if you could help me out by leaving a review wherever you bought the book." And once I did that, my reviews just went and blew up. So it's almost like the person finished the book. Okay, I can do that. I like the book, and go over to Amazon or Barnes and Noble or wherever and leave a review that way. A lot of us do.
No, it's a great strategy, and I think that definitely helps, because if you enjoy the book, you're much more likely to do that when asked than if there's no back matter at all.
Yeah, because usually if you write a good book and that reader really enjoys it, usually a couple things will happen. Usually we'll go straight to the review and say, "Hey, I liked it." Whether it's a short review, a long review, they'll say, "Hey, I liked it. This is what I liked about it." And typically they'll look up that author to find out, "Hey, what's next?" So it works out well.
Yeah, but one of the really cool things that happened after we released that first report was some really sharp folks on Kboards downloaded the raw data, and they basically looked at the review scores and controlled for price, and they controlled for the number of reviews, and they basically found that, you know, it didn't matter, even within the same price band, even within the same number of reviews, that correlation held. So, you know, I kind of grinned at Hugh and said, "See?" But, you know, I think there's a lot to your point as well, which is indies are much more aggressive on average at, you know, reaching out to their fans, and that results in, you know, more positive reviews, I think.
Yeah, this is one of the things we have to do as indie authors.
Yep. Next up, question for me. You talk about audio and print sales along with ebook sales. Have you seen any correlation between formats on sale and earnings? That is to say, do people with audiobooks tend to earn more than people without?
So this is something that we should probably do a great deal more deep analysis on, because it's an absolutely fascinating question. You know, off the cuff, people with audiobooks definitely earn more than people without. But we have to be careful we're not mixing up a correlation with a cause, because audiobooks are expensive to do if you're an indie. And usually you're not going to shell out a few grand for a narrator until your ebook sales are high enough that you go, you know what, I'm going to recoup that. You know, not only can I afford to do it out of what I've earned on my ebooks, but I'm going to recoup it fairly quickly. So whether the audiobooks themselves spur more sales on the e-side or not, the data can't tell us that. I mean, anecdotally, we can talk about it, and we can say, you know what, I've run Kindle countdowns and my audiobook sales spike during that time, for example. So there's definitely correlation, especially if you have their WhisperSync enabled. You know, but and I know, speaking for myself, sample size of one, I've definitely made more money having audio editions than I did with ebooks alone. Last year, I think I made probably pretty close to as much with audio as I did on e.
Impressive. I got to imagine also, until at least recently, I know that Audible used to have like the escalator, or whatever they called it, royalty, where you would get progressively more money depending on how much you sold, and I'm sure that would have really complicated the calculations on earnings.
Oh yeah, I basically went conservative and just used the 40%. In fact, I'm not sure. I'll have to go back and look at the calculation. I might have split it 50-50 between the 40% and the 20% where you split it with the narrator. I'll have to go back and look. But you know, for my own books, I was about 1 or 2 months too late for the escalator, so I missed that party. I know, guys, I've talked to like Michael J. Sullivan, and he did amazing with his audio because he was in quite early.
Alrighty, and my next question would be do your reports look at book lengths? And if so, do epic novels, let's just say the 100,000 plus, perform just as well as those titles who only have, say, 60 to 80K?
So, you know, it's interesting. This is another one of those where I encourage someone to download our spreadsheets and take a look. We do have page length in there in one of the columns because we use it in the KU 2.0 calculations. Speaking for myself, my own books are monsters. They're 150K to 200K. You know, one's 150K, one's 200K. And so the 200K book earns me like $5 per KU read, which is almost twice what I get from a $3.99 sale. And so definitely once KU enters the picture, the longer books do earn more. But I haven't looked at how book length correlates with straight sales. You know, if someone does, please let us know. That would be fascinating because the data's all there in the spreadsheet.
Alrighty, let's see here if Lindsay has her audio back yet.
Can you hear me?
Oh,
Hey, she's there.
You can hear me. I don't know what's going on. But anyway, I have a long question, so it's good that the guys don't have to read it. All right, this is kind of referring to, I guess it was last year, you did a report on a kind of looking at 7 quarters worth of income reports, or, your data over some quarters between February 2014 and September 2015. I assume you let this kind of weed out the one-hit wonders, maybe people getting a BookBub ad, and get a feel for how much people were actually making over time. Could you talk a little bit about that and who's making what and how much are they making?
Absolutely. In fact, thanks for asking that because that is my favorite report of all the reports that we've done. Because we were doing these quarterly snapshots and we could see that from a pie wedge perspective, a large number of indies were doing well. But what we weren't really able to see until we had done several snapshots is whether it was the same indies every report. And we knew that there was more churn on the indie side than on traditional publishing side. Indie bestsellers tend to churn up and down the ranks a lot faster than, say Lee Child or Janet Ivanovich, who will stick up there for a while. So and this isn't necessarily a bad thing. We knew that as a result of that, traditional publishing was very top-heavy. The dollars were concentrated in relatively few authors. But on the flip side, we didn't know if indies were just churning too fast, and people would get their brief moment in the sun, their king or queen for a day. Hey, wow, I hit Amazon's top 100, and then you'll never hear from me again. And 6 months from now, I'm back at the day job cursing Amazon and cursing, the day I ever decided to write. So we didn't know if the churn was bad, if we were seeing the beginnings of true indie careers, or just sort of this churning mass of people getting one shot at the brass ring and then disappearing. And it wasn't until this report that we looked at almost 2 years worth of data, 7 quarterly snapshots. We did exactly as you said and weeded out the people who happened to get lucky on BookBub Day or the day of a traditionally published release that happened to be their moment of glory. If they didn't have consistent appearances and consistent earnings in each of our snapshots, or I think 4 out of the 7, we dropped them from the data set. And then we looked at who was left. And we broke them down into buckets by average annual income, 10K per year, 25K, 50, 100, 250, 500,000 a year, and even $1 million a year. And we looked at, and keep in mind, this is not all of their income, nor is it even all of their Amazon income, or even all of their income from Amazon ebooks. This is just the ebooks that happen to be high enough in the bestseller rankings that they got caught by one of our quarterly snapshots and included in the data set. So this represents just a subset of these authors' incomes. And yet when we broke them out by traditional publishers, small medium publishers, Amazon imprints, and indies, and then we looked at them by author tenure as well, the guys and girls who started 10 years ago, 5 years ago, when the ebook era kind of started, three years ago, and even 2 years ago, what we saw was confirmation that these really were solid careers getting started on the indie side. And in fact, most of traditional publishing's strength in the ebook world came from the names that you've been hearing for the last decade or two. All of the James Pattersons and Lee Childs and Janet Ivanoviches were really commanding, George R.R. Martin's were really commanding the lion's share of the traditional published side, and the traditionally published debut authors were just not doing well in ebooks. And if you take a step back and think about it, you go, well, no kidding. You know, if it's George R.R. Martin for $14.99, yeah, sure, I'll buy that. But if it's a new author that I haven't heard of for $14.99 and there's another book that looks just as good for $3.99, which one am I going to pick? And so we really think that a lot of what we were seeing reflected the effect of pricing. I mean, again, it's easy to read things into the data, you know, and data is just data. It's kind of neutral. It doesn't tell you why it is, so we always have to be careful, but that's what we were seeing. And so we walked away from that. That's my favorite report of all of them. If you're an author and you're looking at a manuscript and trying to make a choice about how to publish, you really owe it to yourself to read it. It's pure dynamite.
Yeah, it was really great to see how many people, even they just got started a couple years ago, but the people that were like able to publish a lot of books really quickly, it's like they could really gain a lot of ground and get the momentum and get up there to like 6 figures surprisingly quickly. I was amazed.
Yeah, no, it's stunning. I look at, you know, I mean, again, sample size of 1, but I look at just what I was able to do with 2 books, and, you know, I was closing in on that 6-figure mark very, very early on, and then just basically did not sustain the momentum. And so I'm pretty convinced that if you're brand new and you're starting out, this is the superior choice, indie publishing. You know, this is how you want to get started, unless you have one of those life-changing, you know, advances come your way, because those essentially guarantee marketing. You know, you want the publisher to have a lot of skin in the game. You want them $100,000 or more in the hole when they get started, because then they're going to have to market themselves out of it, and you along with them.
Yep, I'm still waiting for that offer of $100,000 for a book. I'll let you guys know when that happens.
Fair enough. Well, I kind of posed that question to some friends, and that there really isn't a good answer for what is the offer that makes sense that an indie who's doing at well with their books at a particular level should accept. I think it's really case by case.
Yeah, I feel like with me, it would have to be like, I am good in keeping my own series that I already know are moneymakers, but maybe I'll give them a new series to try out, and because I know I wouldn't want to give up any of my moneymakers right now.
I'm the exact same way. If I had 10 books right now or 15, I probably would try to get one, particularly with an Amazon imprint. I would love to take that ride, but I mean, with only 2, I'm sure not going to give up control over one of them for the uncertainty.
All right, my next question, and I think people will be curious about this. You talked a bit about the churn and how you guys were kind of getting data from everybody to figure out how many sales equated what sales ranking. So someone on Kboards, it was actually Jim Johnson, I think he grabbed some of your data, and he had a list of, like it took 133 sales to hit a 1,500 sales ranking in Amazon, but then only 66 daily sales to maintain it. Can you talk about that? Like, how did you figure out it takes more to get to a ranking and that kind of thing?
Sure, no, absolutely. That factor of 2 is not a coincidence. It's how the math works. So Amazon sales rankings are actually not based on just a day's sales, a single day's sales. They incorporate all of a book's historic sales as well. And while that sounds intimidating, the longer ago a sale was, the less it counts. Basically, you know, you take today's sales plus half of yesterday's sales, add that to it, plus a quarter of the day before, an eighth of the day before that, a 16th, 32nd, et cetera, going back. So you can see, unless you had, you know, a 10,000 sale day, once you're 2 or 3 weeks down the road, that historic stuff really isn't influencing your ranking much. But this series, we're calling it, I don't know what Amazon calls it, we call it recency-weighted cumulative sales, and that's what Amazon rankings are based on. They maintain this number for all books, and it's very easy to maintain because rather than add it up fresh once an hour, all they have to do is take the existing cumulative weight of sales, downweight it by 50% per day, and then add the next day's sales to it. So it's a computational efficiency, and when you've got 400 million products, because they do this not just for books, 400 million products, you kind of want that. And so the net effect of it is there's two ways to get to, let's pick a ranking, top 100. If I'm selling 0, I can do a single day spike of maybe 1,100 or 1,200 sales, and that will put me in Amazon's top 100 for roughly an hour or two. And then unless organic sales kick in, I'm going to drop out of that pretty quickly. Or I can basically be running at a steady rate of roughly 600 sales per day, and that'll be that same 1,200 cumulative weight of sales number as the single day spike, and so I'll just kind of maintain right there at the very bottom of Amazon's top 100. So it's a fun piece of series convergence math, which probably just put half of your audience to sleep, so I apologize. But, yeah,
my dog's barking at a coyote or something, so she woke me up. I'm good. A little scared. But no, we had a box set that I did with a bunch of other authors, like in summer of 2014, and it was it hit the USA Today list. And I was just looking at it the other day. We've taken it off a year ago, but it still has a sales ranking of 60,000 or something in the store, which seems kind of funny.
Wow. Do you know what it's selling per day? You can actually do this math. Once you get used to it, you just do it in your head, and you go, oh, okay, yeah.
It's actually been like a year since we took it down, so that's just on the historical sales that it had.
Wow.
I think it's like 62,000 still, so it's crazy. All right, my dogs are all riled up, so I better pass you back to Jeff.
All righty. My question for you is more a curiosity than anything, and I think you may actually partially answer this. Has Amazon expressed any interest in your detailed reports of their sales? Have they ever confirmed your data, or else flat out said, man, you're full of it and don't know where you're pulling your data from, you're smoking the good stuff? Just wondering what their take is on it.
They have been entirely silent when it comes to our reports, and it's just the weirdest thing. I would love for them to come out and say something official. I'm almost certain, in fact, I am absolutely certain, because we've been conservative. Anytime there was any uncertainty, we sort of tilted the calculations in the favor of traditional publishing to sort of offset our own bias. And so I'm pretty sure if Amazon did come out and announce what the real numbers were, they would make ours look very conservative for indie publishing. With that said, Hugh will occasionally make jokes that Amazon, gets nervous when he's there, and they monitor him because of this project. But the truth is, they're Amazon. They don't care.
Very good point. I was just curious.
I would love to have them, come out and basically either confirm or refute or add some color to it, but they tend not to release a lot of information about sales, which is kind of the reason this report exists in the first place.
All right, we have to ask, because people are going to be wondering, are you factoring Kindle Unlimited into your income estimates or ranking estimates, or how is that affecting things right now?
Absolutely. When Amazon first announced Kindle Unlimited, Hugh and I both thought, uh-oh, there goes our ability to do this and our ability to see what's actually going on. We knew at a minimum it would make doing this really tricky because of ghost borrows. Ghost borrows are when someone downloads but doesn't read the book, or now only reads a small part of the book. It gives an artificial, if you will, boost to the rankings. So when we first started looking at this, I think it was last July or the July before with KU 1.0, we were very relieved when Amazon announced a data point that we could use to calibrate this, and that was how big the KU pot was. And we could use that to back into what percentage of our KU reads were ghost borrows, what percentage were purchases of KU books, and what percentage were KU downloads, which hit the 10% mark. So we used that to triangulate. And then when the KU 2.0 change happened, it actually, ironically, became easier to figure this out because they were also announcing pages read. And we know the page counts for every single book, so we could back into what Ghost Borrow percentage truly was. And so we did this, and it was kind of surprising. I mean, I had to double check it twice to make sure it was right. Our Ghost Borrow number comes out to only about 15%. And on the face of it, it's like, wait, no way, how can that be? Are people truly reading 85% of the books that they're downloading to completion? And the answer is, I don't know. Because it could be one of two things here. One, it could be that the vast majority of KU downloads are popular books that are already high in the rankings, that are selling a lot, and those books tend to get read to completion more often. Or it could also be Amazon has their thumb on the scale. It could be Amazon is discounting KU downloads relative to sales in a way to make up for Ghost Borrows, so that Ghost Borrows don't artificially inflate the rankings when those books are not being read. So I don't know which of those two things it is, but the math works out the same either way. And so we've got that 15% Ghost Borrow factor in our calcs, and then when Amazon announces the KU pot and the number of pages read, we line that up with our data and go, wow, that's close.
Okay, and everybody's always wondering, should I be in KU or should I go wide? Just kind of based on what you're seeing, do you think it's still like a much of an advantage as far as, you know, being in top 100s and more visibility on Amazon?
It's unquestionably providing ranking boost advantages to a lot of folks. I mean, and some people get very upset about this, and they say, well, you know what, borrows shouldn't count as sales. It becomes almost a philosophical discussion. To my thinking, you know, our website's called Author Earnings. If an author's getting paid for it, it's a sale. With that said, once you go into KU, those borrows will boost you up higher, and that gets you added visibility, which also leads to more organic sales in some cases. In other cases, particularly authors that were already selling extremely well without KU, they say it's more like cannibalization of their sales. And, you know, for me, I make $5 on a KU read still, and, you know, $2.80 on a sale. So I'm like, hey, cannibalize away, man. But you know, on a shorter book, the economics, and it's particularly a shorter book for an author who's able to charge $5.99, $6.99, $7.99. All of a sudden, those economics don't look good. So it's a you know, it's a case-by-case thing. If you have a bunch of books, my thinking would be put some in, take some out, rotate them, and see what works for which books, because it's not even on an author-by-author basis. It's on a book-by-book basis. You may get different results.
Definitely sounds like good advice. And yeah, I'll tell people if they can't parlay it into like a top 100 in a category and increased visibility, then it's probably not going to do much for you.
This is true. I mean, the key there is in a category, because if you've got a category that's traffic, this is visibility versus non-visibility. And so I think what we're seeing is for every author who was high-selling already complaining they've been cannibalized, there's 5 new authors gaining visibility who otherwise wouldn't have by being in KU. So it's a trade-off. I mean, everybody needs to try what works best for them. Sorry about the background noise.
Somebody's making you dinner while you chat with us.
Actually, no. I'm over at Stanford campus right now, and probably going to get locked out of the building here because I'm sitting outside.
All right, well, we'll try to wrap it up here pretty soon. Last little question for me is just, you mentioned that if you got an offer from an Amazon imprint that you'd be interested. Could you talk a little bit about how they're doing? They always seem to figure pretty prominently in those reports.
Yeah, well, you can figure that if there's one group of publishers that can make a marketing splash on Amazon, it's Amazon imprints. I mean, sometimes I wonder why they're not doing even better. And it must be Amazon is, you know, basically trying to keep the playing field a little fair. It is fully within their capability to make every single book in the top 100 in Amazon imprint books. So I mean, we've seen the power of their marketing. So the other thing to keep in mind when you assess Amazon imprints is there's only about 2,000 authors, maybe. I don't have an exact number, but I've been able to find something on the order of 1,500 in our data. So I'm hypothesizing 2,000 or so, versus well over 100,000 indies at this point, I think, have popped into and out of our data sets, and probably 80,000 traditionally published authors. So you're really comparing a very, very small slice of authors against the aggregate or average performance of a much, much larger population. When you go, let me try and put this into context. If you look at the top 100 Amazon authors, the top 100 traditionally published authors, and the top 100 indie authors, you don't see that big a performance difference. But if you look at the top 80,000 indie authors and their average sales each, and then you compare that to only 2,000 Amazon authors, of course the Amazon authors are going to be killing it. And so I don't think I really answered the question.
Just say yes if Amazon offers you a deal. I think that was the answer.
Yeah, so the answer is if Amazon offers you a deal, be excited, but at the same time treat it like any other offer from a publisher. Read the fine print, talk to them, make sure you're comfortable with it, and don't be afraid to say no if it doesn't make sense for you.
Good to know. I have one little short question, and we're gonna hand back to Lindsay for potentially some more if there's time. But you mentioned earlier that you pull data also from like Barnes and Noble and Google and like that. So my question was, do you do that? And the answer is yes. So I guess a follow-up question to that would be, do you find that it's harder or easier to tease data out of their information versus what Amazon gives you?
So Barnes & Noble is actually somewhat easier because you can basically start with the book that's ranked #1 and grab them all one after another, versus what we're doing with Amazon, which is going down all the individual bestseller lists and then picking books off of those and seeing what their overall ranks are. So the data set is more complete when we get it from Barnes & Noble, but our rank to sales data is more inexact.
Right, good to know. I figured that would be the case.
Google was the only one where when I pulled the data, I looked at their top 100 and said, I don't know what's going on here, because the rankings in their top 100 don't really seem to correspond to the rankings of those exact same books on other bestseller lists. So I'm not sure if that's merchandising, or some folks have suggested that maybe they collate their top 100 over a different time period. But that was the only one where I looked at it and I said, you know what, this doesn't seem legit.
I don't know, judging by Google Play, I'm not sure they know what's going on there either. Just the ease of using it, or being able to use it right now, which a lot of people are not able to.
Yeah, I'm kind of hoping they get serious about it, because the more retail venues we have for our books, the better.
Definitely. Do you have time to answer a couple questions from Twitter and Kboards here? I've got 3 written down here.
Sure, absolutely.
All right. Okay, Veronica Sicko, probably saying her name wrong. She asked a question we all want to know. I want to know genres, which are selling how much, and what are the trends?
We looked at this in our July of 2014, I think it was, report. There's actually a chart that shows how the different genres break down, both in terms of relative volume and how indies are doing versus Big Five, etc. Romance was the big one. Romance, both in terms of total volume on Amazon and in terms of indie share. Something like 70% of the author earnings from romance were going to indies. Sci-fi and fantasy were also, indies were not only very well represented, but the sales were also quite strong. And I think mystery thriller was larger than SFF and smaller than romance. But the indie share of that, I think, was still sort of in the 25-26% range back then. But, like I said, it's overdue. I should go back and re-update that.
Yeah, one of the things, I think it was before we started recording, you mentioned that some of the genres that are doing really well for indies are, and I think it makes sense, the ones that traditional publishing has been ignoring. Like I mentioned science fiction, romance, and science fiction in general, it seems like traditional publishing was kind of like, oh no, nobody buys space opera. We're not going to publish any of that.
Yeah, no, and I think that was a case where they basically missed the market completely, and indies were able to flood into that gap. I remember a conversation with with the CEO of a large traditional publisher, an online conversation where he was pointing out that, oh, there's really not that big a market for SFF, and traditional publishers were smart not to be in it. And I told him, go look at Amazon's top 100 overall right now, and you're going to find 7 SFF books in there. And guess what? 6 of them are indie. So don't tell me there's no market for this.
All right. Patty Jensen asks, I'm wondering how far you think the traditional industry is willing to let their ebook market share drop before aggressively trying to claw back, or are they just going to let it slide? She doesn't believe they'll do this. And do you think they're actually listening to your reports at all? And what would their tactics to aggressively compete with self-published authors be? That was like 3 questions. You got all that?
I do, and it's an excellent question, and I'm laughing because I honestly don't know the answer. My crystal ball on what other human beings will do is as hazy as anybody's. But with that said, I don't think they can afford to let the ebook market go completely. They're down to a quarter of it. They can't go much further than that. So I think what we're going to see is price reduction. I think they're going to have to come in and compete for price.
Yeah, I've already seen them doing the BookBub ads and dropping stuff to $1.99, at least for a BookBub or a Book One.
That's true. I think we're going to see more of that going forward. But
okay, last question. I'm going to try to read this. This is James Wells. This was on Kboards. They had too much time to write on there. Twitter's better. Okay, he asks, he says, I'm struck by the parallels between the unfolding saga of indie publishing and the innovator's dilemma as documented by Clayton Christensen in the 1990s, where high-end technology companies had their lunch eaten by low-end invaders whose offerings steadily improved until they took over most of the market. The archetypical example, but definitely not the only one, is the takeover by personal computers of most of the space once occupied by mainframes. Similarly to the current situation with indie books, the incumbents derived the new offerings as being low quality and basically not the real thing until they could not be ignored. When looking at trends in indie publishing, have you looked for parallels in other industries for clues on where this may all end up?
Video games. First of all, he's absolutely correct. This is classic Clay Christensen innovator's dilemma stuff. I worked for a startup right in the middle of the .com era that actually handed out Clay's book as part of your package when you when you joined the company. They gave you a leather jacket, a fancy backpack, and Clay's book. So I'm very familiar with the innovator's dilemma, and I think it's a perfect example of what we're seeing play out in this industry. The last place I saw this play out was in video game publishing. So if you recall, around 2007, Apple opened up the App Store, and for the first time there was no need to go through a video game publisher. You could basically put together your app. Once you got it certified, list it for sale in the App Store and get 70% of net. And so, you can see the analogies there to KDP. And it literally took like a year to a year and a half, and you would go to the App Store Top 100, and there wasn't a single video game publisher's name you would recognize. No EA, no Activision. These indie companies, no one had. Hello?
Hello, sorry, I think we faded out a little bit at the end there. Probably a good time to wrap up the show.
Oh, okay, sorry. I think my connection faded there.
That's all right. It's been over an hour, so we really want to thank you for talking to us. And do you have any parting advice? It sounds like you already think, people should probably go indie to start with, especially if they're prolific. But any parting advice for newer authors?
No, I think in a nutshell, if I could offer only one word of advice, it would be study your industry. Don't take for granted that what worked today is going to work tomorrow. Any advice I give now will probably be outdated in 2 years, probably be outdated in 6 months. So it really behooves us all as authors to study our industry and know it.
All right, and people can stop by the author earnings report, right, and get an update so that they know the most recent stuff every quarter. Is there anywhere else that you want people to send people?
Absolutely.
Or... Go ahead,
I would say www.authorearnings.com is where we post our reports. They're all free, obviously. They come each of them comes with the raw data set, so you feel free to download it, poke around, and if you find something interesting, please share.
Yeah, if people were really interested. I told this on a story on a show before that somebody emailed me randomly. Was like, I think you made this much money last year from Amazon. I was like, well, that's pretty close for just Amazon.com, so I guess it's all in the data.
Yep, well, it's all right there. We tried to, obviously we anonymized for author privacy, but if you know exactly what book you're looking for and about where it was ranked or how many pages it was, it's not too hard to find your own books in there.
All right, cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us and answering our questions tonight.
You bet. It was a pleasure, guys.
We appreciate all the info.
Likewise. Take care now. Have a great night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.